Welcome. I commend you on your choice this morning. It's relatively early and there's a lot of competition, but this is essentially going to be a really exciting unpanel. So we're going to throw the mic open to the floor for a lot of discussion and questions, probably more than you get normally at these types of panels. So I urge you to really prepare your questions, and we're going to leave a lot of time at the end for those. My name's Adam Thomas. I am the director of the European Journalism Centre, and I guess full disclosure, I should say that I have taken money from almost all of these people on this panel at some point, and I'm really happy to do so again in the future, just in case we're not clear about that. The EJC is also a funder of sorts. We've given ourselves around 4 million euros in the last 5 years to various journalism activities, and we launched today an Engaged Journalism Accelerator, which is a 1.7 million euro fund supporting journalism that helps communities engage with newsrooms. So I think we at the EJC sit in a really interesting position where we see both sides. So I hope it's not a conflict of interest, but rather helps me engage with the amazing panelists here. If I could have a quick show of hands, who here would be interested in getting funding? So who wants funding? Cool. Who here is a funder? Who gives money here? Daniel, you can put your hand up. See, they don't want to show themselves, because usually at events like this, the funders get harangued and harassed and that type of thing. So to avoid that, the European Journalism Centre, with the help of all the people on stage here, actually set up a community called the Journalism Funders Forum. And we wanted to do two things. We wanted to bring together media organizations and donors to have sort of more meaningful conversations about how we can work together in a constructive and easy and friendly setting, hopefully. And we also wanted to bring new donors into funding journalism. So philanthropists who maybe haven't engaged in the media ecosystem so far, we really wanted to bring them to the table as well and have them speak. There's none here, but that's exactly what we hope to do with the Funders Forum going forward. So maybe I'll do a quick introduction of our panel, and then we'll throw open to some sort of questions and things. So immediately to my right is Stephanie Reuter. She's the director of the Rudolf Augstein Foundation. I'll leave her to talk a little bit about that, but the reason I guess why you're here, Stephanie, is it's a family foundation, so there's a lot of interesting sort of methodologies that they employ and a lot of different ways that they work as opposed to a much bigger foundation. Stephanie herself is an incredible student of the relationship between media and donors as well. There's probably no one who is a better repository of that sort of knowledge than her, I think, if my other esteemed guests don't mind me saying so. Molly, next to her, is the managing director of the News Integrity Initiative. Molly is here for me because she partners with grantees in an incredible way. She has a very humanistic approach, let's say, to funding and really coaching and working with grantees in a way that I think is unique, especially in the American landscape, and I think it brings great benefit to her programs. Nienke is the director from the Stichting Democratie, well, let's say in English, Democracy and Media. My Dutch is still terrible. So the Democracy and Media Foundation. This has an incredibly interesting history coming out of resistance newspapers, and I think one of the really interesting things that Nienke's foundation does is the way that they invest in different types of media businesses, the way they mix ownership and grants and have different share arrangements, so hopefully we can get into some of that. There was a great panel on media ownership yesterday that touched on a bunch of that stuff. And then last but not least is Miguel Castro, who is at the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, who of course I'm sure you all know, but probably a lot of people don't know the kind of role that they also play. They are a huge funder of journalism, but also in ways that kind of are sometimes surprising, and they do a lot of core, I think, infrastructure support of the journalism ecosystem as well as funding just journalism per se. So again, I hope we can kind of get into some of those things. Stephanie, why don't we kick off with you and just tell us, and we'll keep this very conversational and very open, but just tell us how journalism fits into your portfolio, because it's not the only thing that your foundation focuses on, right?
That's right. Thanks for the introduction, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning. Well, for us it's pretty easy, because I like to say that journalism is in our DNA. How come? Rudolf Augstein himself was a well-known journalist, and he stands for freedom of the press and critical journalism. I mean, he went to prison for publishing a critical story in the 60s, and that's why our goal really is to strengthen critical journalism. We have 4 areas of focus, which is investigative journalism, because we are convinced that to hold the powerful accountable is more important than ever. We also focus on cross-border journalism. Of course, we live in an interconnected world, and with network technologies, that's pretty important too. But we also try to enable experiments, especially in terms of business model development, community engagement, and more collaboration. And we support talent in terms of journalistic excellence and diversity. So it fits pretty well in our portfolio, I would say. We also support artistic and social projects, and we have a lot of projects at the intersection of the arts and journalism, which is really interesting too. But I can go into more detail later. So.
Great. Well, I definitely want to come back to that arts journalism and see what the differences are there and see if there's anything around that. Molly, journalism is obviously a big part of what the News Integrity Initiative is, but I get the sense that you really think about this in a civic society in a much broader sense than just, let's say, supporting journalists per se. Is that fair?
Yep, that's fair. Hi, good morning. The News Integrity Initiative has 3 areas of focus. One is around building trust and between newsrooms and the public, but broadly, I tend not to say journalism and journalists is a lot. I like to say news and information because I do like to think expansively about information and the way that we can use information to improve people's lives. We also fund civic dialogue projects in order to increase understanding and empathy among people who may come from very different backgrounds and very different experiences. And we also have a small focus on media, I shouldn't say small, but we have a focus on media manipulation and combating disinformation. And all of that is really about building trust broadly, building empathy between people, and increasing understanding.
That's a great, I think, chance to jump to you, Nienke, because you also, I think, have a pretty broad spectrum of what you fund, and I think dialogue is at the heart of a lot of what you do as well, in terms of especially of empowering and giving voice to certain communities and things. How does journalism fit into that? Is it a core component of what you do?
So thank you, Adam, and thank you everyone for being here. So we do fund rather broadly, although only in the Netherlands, just saying, but we will fund projects that promote a just democratic state and an inclusive just democratic state. So journalism, of course, is a keystone to that. So we do fund quite a few journalistic projects. It can be investigative journalism, it can be a documentary, it can be a podcast, but anything that sort of has that at the end of the mindset. So to improve that inclusive, just democratic state. And then sort of more on a meta level, we've taken on trying to help diversify the Dutch media landscape. So there's quite a lot of people from different communities, and I'm specifically going to highlight people with a bicultural background, so Moroccan Dutch or Turkish Dutch or Surinamese Dutch people who have felt for a long time, and also statistics do prove this, that they don't have a lot of access to mainstream media outlets. And we have taken on also doing calls for proposals specifically for projects surrounding this or for these people, but also it's a big part of our criteria. So whether diversity and inclusion is a true part of a project. And we've been doing this for 3 years now, and it takes patience, but it's really paying off.
Great. Well, look, I'm hoping there's questions that are going to come back about diversity, because I think that's shared by everyone on the panel, and there's some really important things that I think we can learn from other industries as well. Miguel, I'll jump to you. Obviously, probably out of everyone here, you, I guess, have the broadest portfolio at the Gates Foundation. Where does journalism fit in alongside, let's say, eradicating polio or some of your other huge big-ticket items?
Yeah. So what we do, we have a team called the Global Media Partnerships, which is one of the many teams of the foundation that deals with communications issues. So what we do is we try to facilitate that media organizations cover the best way possible wholly unreported issues that are very deserving, like global health, global development, eradication of diseases, and lately a very strong priority on gender equality as well. So our portfolio is devoted to help media organizations to better inform and better engage audiences on those topics. And we do it in our team through mostly through grant making. which is separate from other teams that the foundation has, traditional external relationships work, our own media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, our own websites, etc. And also some work on paid media, on a specific campaigns in which the foundation is involved in a long list of them. So it's one tool of the tool sets in which we attempt to sort of to influence the debate about these issues that we believe are fundamental. I want to just highlight the point that we call ourselves a partnerships team, because what we do is long-term relationships through partnerships that are to the benefit of both the foundation and the goals we have, and also the media partners that we work with. Relationships with those media organizations that we work with, and we have around 40 right now, take a long time to develop, and they only become a proper partnership when both agree that what we do is in a mutual benefit for the audiences that we want to reach and the services that we want to provide. Yeah.
Why don't we deep dive into that? Because I think a lot of the people in the audience would be really excited to know, I think from everyone here, but maybe we'll start with you, Miguel. So to walk us through what it looks like for you finding a new grantee. How does that, because you don't have open calls, for instance.
We don't have open calls directly, but we work with organizations that make open calls, like the European Journalism Center.
Hi.
So what the foundation works really hard on prioritizing advocacy, communications, policy priorities that will benefit the ultimate goals, which are to do with global health, eradication of malaria, polio, or global development, better agricultural work in Africa, or gender equality, access to education for girls and adolescents, girls, or etc. It's a long list of 32 priorities. So once those priorities are set, what we know as well very well, and we work very hard, is and figured out what are the audiences that we feel are necessary to be informed and engaged about these issues, so the right decisions are made, the right policies are approved, the right budgets are procured, etc., etc. So once we have those set of priorities, we will look at the media landscape. We try to figure it out. What are the better partners to to reach out and improve the debate and the quality and the quantity and the content and the reporting on those issues, so that decisions are made in the more informed possible way. And sometimes we go to the media partners that we believe are the most appropriate. Sometimes it's a joint effort in which we come together through campaigns or through conversations. Some others is unsolicited proposals that come to us, and we work really hard, sometimes up to a year, on developing all of those ultimate goals that we want to achieve through journalism. And if it works and everyone is happy and we have a clear outcome that is measurable, that is of interest and serves the audiences that we want to provide a service to, just we go and do it.
I think that's super interesting, and I think that developing relationships part takes a lot of time sometimes. I mean, different funders have different amounts, but it's something I think that especially journalists underestimate how much work that needs, and it's hard for newsrooms to do that. Nienke, I know you think a lot about this in terms of, especially with your open calls and trying to make sure that there's a diversity of people who can apply to it, and you try and lower the barrier as much as possible. Maybe walk us through how your application process actually works.
Sure. I mean, so when I started at the foundation 3.5 years ago, I used to be a grantee of the foundation. And truthfully, I didn't even want to call because I was rather terrified of, the whole power dynamics in the relationship, and always scared that I was doing something wrong or that my application wouldn't be perfect. So I had the wonderful opportunity to set up a fund from a grantee's perspective. And I tried to do so as much as possible, although there are restrictions, because we need to also be able, you need to be able to hold us accountable. So I can't just make any random decision. I need to have a paper trail, and there need to be clear criteria. But so how it works with us is that there are 3 application rounds per year, and you can apply for a project. And we try to keep the application form short and sweet, and sort of maybe perhaps helping a grantee think a little bit about the sustainability and the future of the project. and you will get to know whether or not you're through to the second round within 2 weeks. So one of the things is that we don't want people waiting for months. So in the first 2 weeks, we have a big pressure cooker situation in our office, and everybody's reading applications, and so there's 3 people reading each application, rating them, and then we end up with a short list. So you'll hear that very soon. And then once we've established the short list, then the people in my office will get in touch with the potential grantee and start asking, further questions and asking to elaborate. So if your budget wasn't on point, that's not a reason for rejection. If we think your project's great, we'll then talk to you about your budget. So that's the application process. Then you'll hear in total of 7 weeks whether or not you have received a grant or not. And we really do try to stay in touch and do a little bit more than just give money. Although, there's this buzz going on about being a funder plus, where you do more than just giving money as a funder, because we, of course, have a rather great network of projects and journalists and also activists and movement lawyers that are working on similar topics. So we try very hard to connect people through monitoring and evaluation. We had a meetup last Friday, which was awesome, but also I was a bit nervous about it, because do people really want to spend their time with a funder? And this is a question also for the audience, perhaps. If a funder asks you to come, I understand that you come because you're sort of financially dependent, but do you really want to be there? Do you really need us to connect you to people, or does that make you nervous? Or these are always sort of funny areas to tread, and we're trying very hard to do that in a way that promotes honest feedback.
Molly, do you see yourself as a funder plus in that way? I mean, I know for you, coaching is a huge part of what you do. How do you feel about that term, funder plus?
Yeah, I'd never heard that term before. I kind of like it.
It's very European, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think of myself as funder plus. I hope others think of me as funder plus too. I actually had the good fortune. I'm a little different from my colleagues up here because NII is a project. It's not a foundation, so it's not sort of like an institution, a long-term established institution. But before I worked for the News Integrity Initiative, I worked for a place-based foundation called the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, and I had the good fortune of really stepping into a philanthropy career where this was a foundation that really has a customer service oriented approach to the way that it treats its applicants and grantees. And so I learned a lot there about a lot of what you just said, a lot of like really being mindful of not making applicants jump through too many hoops, and trying to lower those barriers. And then also, speaking to the Funder Plus, the Dodge Foundation does all of this capacity building support. So we used to do, I'm still trying not to say we. I was there for 12 years, so it's hard not to say we. But we did these year-long, actually, programs that would cover all sorts of topics like how to build a board, how to fundraise, how to do better communications. And so I learned from that experience that funders can bring so much more to their grantees than just a grant check. I mean, grant check's great, right? Who's going to turn that down? But we can provide coaching. We can provide connections to other funders. We can provide connections to other complementary work that you may not know about that's happening elsewhere. So I think that's we can convene. Like, that's another thing. I think we tend to really underutilize our convening power. So
what do you mean by convening power?
Convening meaning funders can be sort of an impartial, we have a lot of power to bring people together and facilitate dialogue and conversations among a diverse group of people, not just funders, but like government officials and corporations or whoever it might be that needs to be at the table. Funders have tremendous power to be able to invite those people and get them into a room together. So that's something I think we don't do enough of and should do more of.
Great. Stephanie, how about you? Because obviously I guess you would feel you probably have limited resources compared to some other funders, both in Germany and Europe generally. How do you use those resources to go out and find new projects and make sure that you're keeping a diverse portfolio that also hits all of your goals and your strategy?
Well, we also, like the Democracy and Media Foundation, like Grant Giving Foundation, so that means that we do not have our own programs. We are normally waiting for applications. We receive several hundred applications per year, so we are pretty busy. But you can approach us whenever you're ready. So we are working without deadlines in our journalism funding, which can mean sometimes we are small, but it's also a good thing because we can be really agile. That means if it's a time-sensitive issue, if it's a project that really needs money or resources immediately, we can decide within a day if it's supposed to happen, so we can make that happen. But it can also take up to 12 weeks until you receive the decision, so it always depends. Of course, we do a lot of long-term operational funding, so we have a lot of grantees with whom we are working for a long time. But it's always important that you also find that balance between short-term and long-term funding, right? That your resources are not bound to all your long-term projects. So yeah, and it's pretty important, I think, to have open calls, or that it's able that new grantees can approach you whenever they like, because I mean, we know who we know, but we do not know who we do not know, and so it's really it sounds so simple. Yeah. But there are always new actors, and so that's really important too, I think, for a foundation, because we all know about the power imbalance, and yeah, it's pretty difficult sometimes for people to approach a foundation.
Nienke, you look like you wanted to.
Well, I just want to say that it's so important that you do have some kind of rapid response option, and we've tried to install a separate sort of process where if something is urgent, we will also try to respond, not in 24 hours, that's great, but like within a week. Although the things that we get that are time sensitive rarely really are. But it's so important for funders to realize that taking 3 months to make a decision, if that's your process, then that means that you're missing out on a few great projects.
And yet, there really are, I mean, from my perspective, at least in the US, there really aren't very many foundations I can think of that have rapid response like that. And one of the things that, one of the appealing aspects of the News Integrity Initiative for me, and one of the reasons why I took this job, is because I can be that flexible and I can make those decisions very quickly. And it is really important. You miss out on opportunities otherwise. You know, months-long processes are just so difficult, and unless you've been on the, you know, so many funders have never been on the other side of that, and so they don't really understand how difficult that is.
So I just want to add the point of the differentiation between the decision-making time and the time to design the actual program and project and outcomes, etc. So if you take 3 months to make a decision, when you get to the point in which you know what you want to do, that's bad. However, I do believe that the process of developing a project together is a very rigorous process that has to do with financial grants management, operational, programmatic, etc., etc. So I don't feel really bad by sometimes taking a year to develop a project, because what we know for our experience is that our ratio of failures on actual implementation of the operational part of the project is very low. So very few fail operationally because they're very well designed. We fail in reaching outcomes plenty of times, but operational in the implementation, none or barely none have. But before working for the Gates Foundation, I worked for the Open Society Foundations for 8 years, where there were times in which we could get a contract out in a conflict area like Burma or others in 24 hours. There is a role for that. So there are places, there are times, there are projects that need that. You need the level of risks is higher, and sort of the return on investment merits to take a contract out in 24 hours. I mean, we in the Gates Foundation, we can't physically do that, but there is room for both. So the decision making, once the project is defined, should be quick. But defining and designing the project, that should take a long time, because it's a very rigorous process and it has to be owned by both. I think that the way of solving the problem dynamic is when the project is owned by the grantee and the funder 50-50. And only when that happens and when both feel that we're there is when you should sort of pull the trigger.
How much do you, and I'll just throw this open to everyone, how much do you feel like you have to fight internally for these things, or internal structures? How much are they a barrier? Because I understand that you have your own rigor and your own diligence, but how much do things like reporting and boards and all these things make your life more difficult as someone who wants to actively give money?
So, I mean, it's an incredible amount of work, but it's a rigor that is worth.
Yeah.
In my case, so we are a very large foundation, so grants of $100 million that the foundation does have pretty much the same process and structure and legal procedures as a grant of $250,000. So when you're doing a $250,000 grant and you go through a legal review and a grants management review and a financial review that is so rigorous that it looks like a KPMG audit, then it's tough. But I think the rigor is worth it.
Yeah. Nienke, how about you?
I mean, I have the good fortune of being the director of a very small organization and to have a board who supports what we do so much and so genuinely that to me, I would say I have no internal struggles whatsoever. But colleagues at other foundations face, you know, if you work for a family foundation, have a living donor, or if there are, you know, very strong-headed boards, will go through a long process and then things will end there. And that makes them more cautious to begin with. So there's lots of internal struggles. It's actually a lot harder to give money than you'd think if you're looking for it.
Yeah, well, so I'm in the fortunate position of not having a board right now. I have an executive committee, and they're also extremely supportive, and I have tremendous flexibility to be able to make decisions about how the News and Integrity Initiative is going to invest its dollars. But I did work for an organization that had a board, and I do know what that internal struggle is like. And I think what grantees don't understand is how much program staff, how much advocacy we do internally, and how much I always sort of think of it as like throwing elbows and, you know, just like being very protective of the things that you are trying to make a case for internally, around, you know, because there are issues around budget, there are issues around just general aversion to risk, and so there are just a lot of complications internally, and so there's so much of the job of being a program staff at a foundation in philanthropy is about being very strategic about the things that you want to advocate for and get funded, get permission to fund.
Yeah, pretty often, maybe I can add that, the board is a bit more risk averse than you probably are, right? So we know the field, and I mean, our grantees are our ears and eyes in the field, and we are like constantly at conferences and talking to other foundation managers and talking to journalists. So sometimes it's also pretty important to keep in mind that the managing director or the program officer might be a bit more take bigger risks, but then it's really important that we also are able to convince our boards. And I mean, foundations are in a really privileged position to take risks because we are the ones who do not have to make profits. I mean, not at the market, it's a social profit, of course, and we need successful projects. But then on the other hand, I would say if we do not fund projects that fail, we have failed because then we haven't really taken those risks, right? And it's not about due diligence, as you mentioned, Miguel, I'm totally with you. It's pretty important that you have a good process and that you try to evaluate everything in advance and that you're in touch with your grantees. But it's also important sometimes to make a big bet if possible, so yeah.
I would love to throw it open to the audience, sort of uncharacteristically early for a Perugia panel, but so we have one question here and we have one question here. Are there microphones in the room? While the microphone is coming up here, quick fire question, is it cool to come up to you in a bar in Perugia and pitch you my journalism project?
No.
Miguel?
Is it
cool to come up to you in a bar and pitch you my journalism project?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Nienke says no. Molly?
I don't love it.
Stephanie?
I would say yes, but keep in mind we have a focus on German-speaking countries, and we do not fund content at all. So we do not fund individual stories. We are interested in structural, long-term solutions for the field. So if you come up with a bold, great idea, I'm happy. I'm happy to talk to you, definitely.
You should put that on a T-shirt.
It's a very big T-shirt. Okay, so we had one question. Okay, so the gentleman with the mic there, and then we're going to come here, and then we're going to go here, and then we're going to go here. Good hands, people. Nice.
Hi, Dennis Redmond. I teach international media here at the Graduate School of Journalism of Perugia. I have two small questions. One, if you're a corporation and you want to donate, have any of the conditions changed, and do you want to donate through one of your foundations or one of your organizations directly? Let's say you're a consumer corporation, or has that changed or evolved in the, let's say you're a consumer company, whatever company it is, has that changed in the last few years? And secondly, can each of you mention, maybe without names, projects which in the past year you have been proud of, and those that have gone wrong, and why? Each of you, one of them, if you don't think it's indiscreet, or so that way the people, you'll avoid people coming up to you saying, "Oh, that failed." So.
That second question is a great one. I have it on my list, and we're going to come back to it. If I understood the first question, it was about what's changed in the environment for corporations and corporate giving.
Yes, let's say you're
okay. I mean, I think no one here is a corporation. I don't know if you want to answer that question, but no one here is on a corporate fund, I guess.
Well,
I suppose. Mr. Gates.
No, I guess, so the difference, I mean, there's a difference between corporate social responsibility and obviously and philanthropy. So, I mean, in this conference, both Google and Facebook do support a lot of journalism, and they are corporations, and they do it through a different legal environment. Private foundations and philanthropy are highly regulated 501c3 type of organizations, whereas corporations through corporate social responsibility have a lot of less restraints, so it's more like self-imposed rules. I think that the legal framework is conducive to a lot more investing in media than it is right now, and why it's not happening, I really don't know, but I don't see that happening. Corporate social responsibility, investing in media outside of specific campaigns, advocacy campaigns.
Right.
But there is nothing to stop corporations from investing in media through corporate social responsibility that I know of.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to come back to this question, and then I'm going to take these two questions. If I go with you first, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Solange. I'm coming from Rwanda. I work with a network of 100 journalists, a local NGO of journalists. From the beginning, I assume that when speakers are talking, they are talking globally. But in Africa, we have some specificity, especially in getting funds. I know Melinda Foundation is supporting some activities in Rwanda, but it is in health, education, if I'm not mistaken. But we have some problem to access to funds as media. We have a few donors in media, especially in Rwanda and in the region. My question is, are you operating, when you were talking, I would love to know if the call for proposal, the grantees, they are open for at the international level, or if you have some partners at the local level, in the region, in the country, or neighbors country, so that for us to start the collaboration, because as an NGO, we get some donors, but few really in media. Health, education, investment, we have many, but when we talk when we start to talk about media, it seems like it's not a priority. The priority is to access to education, to eat, to health. So I'd like to know really some that kind of information. Thank you very much.
Great question. We'll take one more, and then I'll sort of bundle these up and come back to the panel.
It It's very similar to what I wanted to ask. Mira Milosevic from Global Forum for Media Development. Thank you for a great panel. One of the questions our members ask is very similar to this from Rwanda, is related to lowering barriers of access and how we can democratize the whole process of grant giving for small operations that don't have capacity to do complicated grant proposals. So that's one. The other comes from organizations that have multiple grants, and that is there a space to standardize grant making across the board, especially for private foundations? Budgets, impact assessment. And the third is, would you be willing to work with us to organize some kind of consultancy clinics for refuse projects, especially for small organizations, so that we can kind of learn from failure and give access also to people who don't have time, money, or resources to come to conferences like this? Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have a lot of questions to get through there, but I promise I'll try to get through all of them. And on your last point, we can definitely help with that with the accelerator, because we have actually set aside funds to do exactly that. So why don't we first of all, and I want to avoid this going down the line thing, I'm terrible at that, sorry. So just put your hands up. Who would like to talk about a project that they saw as a real success that they're very proud of, maybe in the last 12 months? Nienke?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a project that I talk about more often and that you probably all know about, so, or maybe not. Back in 2013, the Democracy and Media Foundation was a very early supporter of De Correspondent, a Dutch startup, digital native, no advertising membership project. And so when these 4 people came up to my foundation and said, we have this great idea, do you want to fund us? We took that leap of faith and we took the risk and we said, yes, this is great. This is perhaps going to disrupt the Dutch media world. And if it doesn't, then it's an experiment worth doing. Turned out it was a success. They did an incredible job. And in the last 12 months, we've moved from supporting a startup to supporting a scale-up, because they're now moving on to the membership puzzle and perhaps also the English-speaking world. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is it's an easy one, I get it. I mean, everybody loves The Correspondent, so for me to say, hey, we funded that makes me look very cool. I know, so I did also take that into account. But there is another reason, which is that we really didn't know if this was going to be a success. There was no there wasn't market research, or there weren't any parameters. It was a leap of faith. It was an experiment worth doing, and it's super cool to see that the experiment is still going and that it's actually perhaps becoming part of the cool establishment.
Tell me about one that didn't work for you.
So I'm not so sure about that question, and that's not because I can talk about personal failures forever, but I don't necessarily feel that any of the projects we've funded have failed. It's specifically because of this attitude. So everything we do, the thing we feel about the most strongly is this is worth a try. And even if it then doesn't become what it promises to be, that doesn't mean that it was a failure. And especially if you as a funder then let it go, never talk to it again, and then get a report back and hear that it didn't live up to its expectations, then that might feel as a failure. But because we stay in contact, and we'll get a call from people who say this is going wrong or this isn't going the way we were hoping for, that just feels like helping the field, and that's my role.
Maybe I can add something to that, because I think it's a really important point also for grantees. We really like to encourage you that we have open, truthful, authentic conversations. So as you said, if a project fails or doesn't meet its objectives, it doesn't have to mean that we are not funding them again. But it's really important because we as foundations are learning organizations, right? And we can we collect those learnings and we give it to other grantees, we share our experiences. So that's a really important point. And it's super important that we are open about what did not work well, because as you also mentioned, it's the Foundation Plus approach, I guess. If you also give non-financial support, it means we have to know where do you have, what do you need? Maybe you need a business coach, maybe you need something totally different, but you have to tell us, because otherwise it's not possible to help. So I think that's really important. And maybe I can also mention another good example.
Do it. Tell us your favorite project.
Because we're here in Italy, I'd like to mention a project with a European scope. It's called Investigate Europe. They just started last year. We're one of the early funders. They got funding from several European countries. There are 9 journalists who are based in 8 different European countries, and it's about investigative cross-border journalism. But what I really think is super interesting about that project is that they also try to find a business model for investigative cross-border journalism. So it's still, we do not know if it will work out. Fingers crossed, but I think it's just a really exciting approach, and yeah, we keep funding. So
it's the sustainability aspect there that you're excited about.
Can I go into a little bit of that, Adam? Because what Stephanie just said about having genuine, authentic conversations is something that I also really want, but it's really hard, no? I mean, as a grantee, to have a really genuine, authentic conversation with a funder about something that has gone wrong, it's a lot to ask. So I'd love to, if anybody has any advice on how we can ensure that, or help you with that, or be more approachable in that sense.
We'll come back to the room to ask just that.
But it's also what Miguel said. I mean, it's about trust building, right? And that needs time. You can't have that like within a month or 2. So it really takes time, and that's why I would say it's pretty good if you have long-term funding, because then you know your grantees and you know them better and better. You get to know them better and better. So, yeah.
Right. I mean, I totally agree with that too. And as you are continuing that relationship with those grantees over the long term, it also helps to consistently reinforce that you're an ally and an advocate for that work, and you're not out to punish. You can't be an ally if you don't really know what's happening behind the scenes. So, being very communicative about wanting to help and not wanting to punish, I think, is a really important part of what we do.
Molly, give us an example of a successful project. I mean, you're still relatively new at News Integrity, so those haven't played out, but maybe you also have one from the Dodge Foundation.
Do I have to pick one? Okay, so, well, I sort of feel like I should talk about a lot of the civic dialogue projects because there are several sessions here in Perugia, but the one I talk about the most that I really love, that's like really near and dear to my heart, is an organization called Free Press in the US, and they run a project called News Voices, and they're doing this in New Jersey and in North Carolina right now. And it's really using a lot of community organizing tactics to bring journalists and a really diverse cross-section of a community together in person to talk about what the issues are going on in that particular town, what news and information people feel is missing, what they need, what they want, how they want to participate. And it really opens the eyes of the journalists to all the different stories they had no idea they were missing. It helps the people from the public really understand like what the daily challenges are for journalists in their own sort of limited capacity. And it starts to build trust between newsrooms and the public. It starts to build a collaborative spirit. The other thing I love about this work is it's sort of dependent on a lot of this work, is dependent on the people who are leading it. And in this particular case, the 2 people who are leading it in New Jersey and North Carolina are incredibly patient and empathetic and inclusive, and they're also really great connectors. So for me, the success is also about how well the people you fund are also connecting the dots between a lot of the other things that you're funding or the things that you care about and want to succeed. So the more that you're sort of strengthening the networks, I think is a huge success. And News Voices for me is one of those. It's just like a huge success because they've been able to connect the dots among so many different organizations doing complementary work in those places.
Interesting. I love this idea of connectors. Miguel, how do you what does success look like for you? Do you have a project that you're particularly proud of?
Yes, several. So
I assumed you'd have one or 2, of course.
AJC, obviously. So the foundation believes that countries in Western Europe that are very generous, especially through their overseas development aid, we need to either maintain or increase that financial support from Western governments to countries where are less developed. So one of the obstacles that we identified from early on, pretty straightforward, is that some of the coverage of the countries of less developed world in Southeast Asia, Africa, etc., was not conducive to the idea of my investments are worth it. There is a lot of corruption. Where did this money goes, etc., etc. So we have been working for a while. We helped Le Monde to launch Le Monde Afrique, which is the their edition for the Africa markets, and also for French-speaking audiences in France who want to consume news and information about Africa. And we did similarly with El País, a section called Planeta Futuro, where they also cover the developed and less developed world in a comprehensive, professional, nuanced way. They are both incredibly successful by all accounts. They have both changed both the way these large media organizations report about Africa, which used to be mostly about war and crises and famines, etc., to a more nuanced where there is actually sections about culture, sections about technology, etc. So how these two large organizations have changed and how their own reporting and how they affected the conversations about how Africa is seen from both Spain and France is pretty remarkable, and something that we're very proud of.
So I get that theory of change idea that you're obviously trying to almost build a market for investment by changing how people view those countries. In response to our colleague from Rwanda, do you think you're investing enough in media? Because this is a criticism we get at the EJC for our IDR program, is that we're essentially paying Western journalists to parachute in, report, and bring those reports back. So do you feel like collectively we're doing enough?
Half of our portfolio is in Africa, so as large as the portfolio is, it doesn't give us the ability to invest in all of the countries that we want to. So for us, in our specific case, we just had to prioritize. And our priorities are in Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa, a little bit in Tanzania, etc., etc. So it's an issue of resources. The needs are everywhere.
Yeah.
So we just...
what did that decision-making look like? Let's say, because Francophone West Africa, for instance, or Francophone Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, how did that come about? Do you choose a country first? Is it part of a bigger strategy where you feel like that's, that there's a weakness there that you can intervene?
So the prioritization is made on the basis of the greatest opportunity for impact of the foundation at large. So then the media investments and the advocacy and the policy and the government relationships and all of the programmatic ones come after. So those countries that I listed are priorities of the foundation at large that we just adapt to. Every once in a while with organizations that work at a Pan-African level, we do some work in other countries, but it's always through intermediaries just because we don't have the financial and the resources and the capacity to do it. But we obviously would like to.
You are both obviously country funders, fairly specific, or at least language funders. Molly, are you thinking of dipping your toes sort of into, for instance, you've been funding in Europe now with the Engaged Journalism Accelerator. I know you're looking at other places in the world. How does that fit into your strategy?
Yeah, it's really tough, actually. It's something I've struggled with quite a lot, if I'm being honest, because I went from a place-based foundation where the geography, like my colleague sitting next to me, it's very, it's so much easier to think about your work when it has a very tight geography, and News Integrity Initiative is a global initiative, and yet we don't have the resources to be truly global. And so we've been trying to think about, okay, so we don't have any on-the-ground knowledge or infrastructure in any place besides the U.S., so how can we meaningfully plug into some other places with partners like EJC? We've also partnered with Internews, which works all over the world. How can we sort of plug in and try to be good partners and be global within the sort of the limited resources that we have? The other way that we've sort of thought about it is we do have the ability, again, to go back to the convening point, we do have the ability to convene, and so it's more of an opportunistic approach right now, but where we see some interesting opportunities to partner and learn around specific topics like media manipulation, for example, we can do workshops in other places. So we went to Ukraine last fall and learned directly from journalists from Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia about media manipulation and propaganda, and what US journalists might, post-election, what they might be able to learn from those who have been living with it longer than the US journalists. And so we do some opportunistic things that way, but it's very hard for us to be global with our grant dollars.
Yeah. So I want to flip your second question on its head, and rather than thinking about how do the grantees lower the barrier to access, because I think we've had a couple of examples of that, let's think about what you look for in a great proposal. So when a proposal comes into you or some kind of engagement comes into you, what are the things that make your eyes light up? What are you like immediately gives you a sense inside of like, okay, this is a project or a person I want to work with? Stephanie, why don't you kick off?
I guess what you said is really important, the person behind the project or the organization. We are looking for really diverse teams if possible. We are looking for bold ideas if possible. We are looking for people who are really passionate about the idea, who are solutions oriented, who'd like to collaborate with others, who do have a network. It's what Molly already mentioned with the bridge building. We do look always for projects that can have leverage effects, which means that a lot of journalists can benefit from, because that's how we work. And yeah, that's it pretty much. But as we already said, it's really relationship driven. So you have to show us why it's so important, why we should not miss out funding your idea, funding your project. And you have to make a compelling case, of course, and you have to tell me, well, there's a specific gap and we'd like to fill it, and we know who else is out there and what they are doing, right? You have to show me that you're also aware of all the others and how you fit in and how you'd like, as I already said, collaborate with them. And then that's something that really energizes us and what we like to fund, yeah.
So I do believe very strongly that there is no issue with the quality and the quantity of journalism that you can find out there. So there is an incredible amount of really good journalists, really good organizations out there. Fantastic content, not a problem to find it. So what really tickles me is when someone comes with what's next. So yeah, I'm going to produce good content and I'm going to produce a lot of it. But so what do you know about how is that going to be consumed? How is going to consume it? How are you going to affect those who consume it? And what is the ultimate goal that you want to with the content that you're going to produce? So when someone comes to me or to us with that already fairly thought through, we are halfway the process. But there is still a lot of I do really good journalism, and I do a lot of it.
Please
why
give me
don't
money.
you fund me?
Yeah.
And that's doesn't work anymore.
Nienke, do you see a lot of applications like that? Just like, give me money.
Of course, yeah. I understand too. I mean, yeah, I used to want money, so and now I'm working with it, and I'm sure there will be a time when I'm looking for it again. So I understand that completely. And with everyone, all the things everyone has said so far do completely and utterly also ring a bell with me. What Miguel mentioned, this sort of having your eyes on the impact that you want to achieve, so sort of the theory of change without making it too much of a theory of change. So yes, I agree with all that has been said. And when you're in a job interview and they ask you about your weaknesses and you're like, well, I'm a perfectionist, and so we have a risk sector in our application form, and I really love it when a grantee fills out that risk form very honestly and says, well, we could completely and utterly fail, but not like that. But I mean, has a realistic sort of approach to, okay, these are the potentials for failure. These are the potential risks. I like that because then we can see that we can really have a conversation about this.
I would like to throw it open to the floor now, because I think we have about 10 minutes left. If anyone also wants to answer the sort of, or offer suggestions to the panel on how they can help you have more honest conversations with you, and if there are things there. But I want to get to some new... Yeah, I'm gonna try and get back to it. You asked 3, I got to 2. So we will go 1, 2, 3 here in the front row, if that's okay. So there's 1 here in the front row, and then the 2 behind. Thank you.
That was a great session. Thank you so much. So I wanted to ask a question of you guys collectively as funders, which is how can lessons learned from media development projects be better shared, including with the developing world? Because I've worked in this sector for 5 years, both as a staffer in a media development agencies and also as a contractor. And what I see is that the outcomes, including what worked and what didn't at a very granular level, not what gets written up in Medium, often dies with the reports to the donor. And it's not only not prioritised, it's also not funded, that those knowledges are shared. So that's one thing. And the other thing is just a very quick question about sustainability, and I don't mind if we don't get to it. But there is this expectation often from donors that projects will become sustainable businesses, and this is not a great time to be starting up a media business. And media development projects are often project managed by people who don't have any background in journalism or business. So it's a really big ask, I think. So I just wanted to chuck those 2 questions up to you because I think they're really important.
Great, fantastic. I'll take 2 more questions here. If you can keep it to 1 question per person, and I'm going to come to you for really short answers so we get through as much as possible.
Milica Pešić, Media Diversity Institute, London. I'm sorry if I'm going to be arrogant, but I've been for 20 years in this field, sustainability issue. We know, and you are supporting philanthropy journalism, that good journalism, particularly right now, has a really issue of surviving. But what I wanted to ask you guys is, what is the percentage of new projects or new grantees you take on board? And second question, very quick, I'm right now evaluating 8 million euros project in media development field. And you guys, you donors, put in your theory of change, by the way, a new buzzword, every donor wants you to do theory of change. You put there that you expect the implementer, through training journalists, to contribute to more independent media in the region. How do you put the link between the two? It's a miracle for me. So these are the 2 questions. Thank you.
Great.
I have 1 question.
You are my new best friend.
I do have 1 question. If an organization has a plan towards sustainability, a long-term plan that requires a significant investment, like several $1 million, and has pilot phases but a long-term plan, how do we begin to have that conversation that says, look, I need $10 million in 10 years, and the result will be worth it?
Great question. Okay, I'm going to come to the panel really quickly. I would like you to each answer very quickly the percentage of projects that you fund that are essentially new as opposed to renewals. Do you have that kind of figure available? It's sometimes a little tricky.
I don't have a figure, but it's way more than half.
Way more than half, Miguel?
Around 25%.
25% are new.
New every year, yeah.
Yeah. Molly, you're a new fund.
100% are new right now.
You win.
So.
I would say 50%.
50%. Okay, then let's go to the sustainability question, I think. Or Miguel, you...
So on the question of knowledge sharing, so definitely there is incredible room for improvement, but there are lots of resources out there. There is the Media Shift Impacts Metric, there is the Media Impact Funders blog, there is the Media Impact Project out of USC, GFMD has a blog, the Communications Initiative has incredible amount of content every day. So yeah, all of these that I listed are public blogs. So definitely, so donors, we meet and we coordinate much less than we do. But there is, to say that there is no knowledge sharing, I don't think I have a time in a lifetime to read everything that is produced. Only on these 6 that I listed. So. And there is definitely room for improvement.
Yeah. Molly, you wanted to jump in.
I mean, I would just say one of the things that's hard about that, we should all be writing about our work more often, and it's hard to carve out the time to do that. But another really honest way to answer that is a lot of those little learnings are really dependent on specific people, and you can't call out specific people. You know, you don't want to do that because You just don't, right? So I can think about one, I'll make it a generic example that also answers the earlier question about failure. You know, a couple of grantees that I have said goodbye to in the past are because they're terrible collaborators. And I can say that generally speaking, yes, you know, but I don't, you know, it's sort of not my style to be negative about the work. I want to be positive about what is working and not call out people specifically for their personal issues.
Nienke, do you think it's fair to say that you, as donors, generally not good enough at sharing sort of lessons learned from projects?
Well, you know who you're asking this question. I mean, that's like that's something I'm very passionate about, and I'm trying to be one of the drivers of that. There is more knowledge sharing between funders. So we do meet and we do convene and we do share knowledge, increasingly so. Mm-hmm. I think, and I'm not sure because I've only been in this field for 3.5 years. So Miguel and Molly and Stephanie probably also will know better, but that funders used to be kind of closed off and anonymous, and I'm very happy to note that here in Perugia also we're part of the ecosystem. So we're not the enemy, but we don't rule it either. We're part of the ecosystem and we have a role, and that role is also to talk and to be sort of transparent and open for feedback and for suggestions. So yes, I'm passionate about it. I think we're trying. I think it's not within the culture of philanthropy, but it's increasing.
Maybe I'll jump to the next question, and Stephanie, I'll come to you on sustainability of projects, and how do you think about engaging with projects that are only going to work if you really commit a large amount of money on a long-term scale? I mean, you do fund infrastructure, you do think about core. Walk us through how you think about that.
Well, we do have a few projects where we know they will never make a profit, right? And we do fund some of them for the last 10 years, so that's quite a while, especially for us, because we are just around since 2005. So we do know that there are important projects, organizations that do incredibly essential work that you have to stick to and fund for long term. But then on the other hand, I mean, we've spoken about that problem with long term, short term. You also know I have a limited budget and I have to think about that pretty hard, where to put my resources. The question Simon just asked, if you need a really big investment, like 10 million within the next 10 years, that's pretty difficult for us because we are a smaller foundation with an annual budget of 1.5 million euros. So that's not as much. I mean, when we are sitting here next to the Gates Foundation, you have like 3 billion per year or something. It's like, wow, right? So, but it's also something you have to keep in mind, that the foundation sector itself is so complex and there are so many different foundations out there, and a lot of foundations do not have that much money, but of course we have the big, mostly American-based or US-based foundations. So yeah, it's hard, but what I think is really interesting too is, I mean, Nienke also mentioned foundations, we talk to each other, and pretty often it would be a good advice, I think, to bring together several funders who are convinced about a project, and then we can invest together in your idea. And it's not just about the money, it's also about knowledge sharing and giving you support. And for a bigger project, that would be, I think, a good way to do it, because then you have a much broader funding base, which is better for your project. So
yeah, so to build on from what you just said, Stephanie, I think, and bounce off your question about needing 10 million in 10 years, which is pretty much half my budget of 10 years, but we do occasionally make exceptions. And so I've mentioned the correspondent already, and hello, Emily, by the way, yes, an organization we've been funding for a while and now have decided to sort of do a beat funding thing where we are also continuing to fund their next project. What I really like about this is that we created a real conversation about it, and we were a part of the conversation about the expansion. So it was very much a sort of inclusive, not an inclusive, that's not the right thing perhaps, but a sort of more shared experience, if I can say that. And we don't have 10 million in next 10 years, but I do know a lot of other funders, and I have access to those other funders, and I understand a little bit what those other funders might need or want from a project. Mm-hmm. So what I was able to do was to connect them to another funder who I knew would also be interested, and to then work with this other funder to not make the lives of the people at the correspondent really hard by having to do the same process twice, just slightly different, but by collaborating on this and seeing if we could share as much as possible the process. And so this is new to us, but I hope it's the start of a new way of working for many other foundations as well, or perhaps they're already doing it.
I'm going to go back to the room if that's okay, and I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions. If you can keep it to 1 question, I will buy you ice cream. Suddenly all the hands go up. So I can't see the back, so somebody ask a question. Samir, go for it.
I'll have pistachio, thanks.
Okay, very good.
So I'm doing a lot of work with funders, as you know. One of the questions that I have, I'll boil it down to this. You've talked a lot about what's next in terms of the field. You've talked a lot about the field. You've talked about, in a sense, the direction from funders to the field. What's next in terms of grant-making practice? What's the big shift in how you do your work? What's the field telling you about how you should change? And particularly, I'm thinking about other areas like activism, where, for example, 4 European foundations have got together to create a participatory fund, which is managed. It's sort of administratively managed by, hi David, administratively managed by a foundation, but the decisions are made by the activists themselves. So is there a point at which you would do that for journalists?
No ice cream.
Journalists that much?
That's no ice cream, no.
Yeah, that's 2 questions, no ice cream. Next.
Yeah, sure. Krina Boros from Investigate Europe and Open Democracy. I'd like to ask the funders, when you grant money, how close an eye do you keep with your grantees? And how close in touch you keep with them? And what are your expectations and the strings attached that come with your money, if any? Thank you.
Wow, okay, there's a lot there. Let's try and go down the panel really quickly. What do you think is next in grant making? What do you think is coming in terms of the models? Miguel?
So I do believe that we really need to keep an eye on grant making as it is right now. Some of the largest philanthropy organizations that have been set up over the last 3-4 years are not grant making organizations. They're not operating under the rules of 541(c) status, which are highly regulated, and rightly so. So Mark Zuckerberg creates a large philanthropy organization through a different set of rules. So did Aguiar in the past, etc., etc. So I personally think that we should keep an eye on maintaining the really good rules and environment that the grant-making space makes in terms of handling power relationships, in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency, and all of the legal status that comes with it. But at the same time, it is quite exciting the flexibility that other mechanisms to invest in media give you. So I'm not complaining about that at all. But if I personally want to put any energy on, is in maintaining the role of grant making and the environment in which we operate right now, because it's the right one.
Nienke, how do you feel about what's coming down the track for models of philanthropy?
So let me combine the 2 questions slightly, because are there any strings attached? How much can you be an ally on the one hand, and what's new in philanthropy and funding on the other hand? I feel there's a combination there, which is that we want to be, I think everybody at this table is very progressive in the ways in which we look at our funding practices, and would very much like to be an ally to our grantees. But it's also kind of the same as wanting to be friends with your employees, because there's always going to be a power disbalance, and it's something we need to remain very mindful of, and I think everybody at the table here will be. To come to Samir's question, what's new? Samir, you know I love the idea of participatory grant making, and in activism, and particularly in our call for proposals against discrimination of Muslims in the Netherlands, this is something we're going to be working with. For journalism, it's a little bit more difficult, because journalists don't want to tell their ideas necessarily to other journalists. So there's an infrastructure that we need to work out. I'd be up for it. I think it's good. And I think it ties into the fact that we're becoming increasingly aware of who has the power to make a decision, and if that's the right person to have that kind of power. So a sort of decolonizing philanthropy, perhaps. One of the things we've been doing for the last year or two, perhaps, is having people from the field be part of our review process. So every call will ask somebody from the field to also be a reviewer and to sit with us and to then learn the ins and outs of how we work as a foundation, but also give us information that we would never have because we're in our ivory towers. So I think, you know, the power shift, the participatory grant making, the looking at in a different way at who gets to make decisions, I very much hope that's new in philanthropy. To us it is.
Molly, any trends from the US that you think are maybe really positive?
No, I don't. No, I don't think so. I think it's still very conservative. I mean, I really appreciate Miguel's point about power. Both of you actually about power. You know, as I see. You know, new people come into grant-making roles at foundations in the U.S. who have not had a career in philanthropy. Maybe they're a former journalist or whatever, and they come in and now they have this power to give away money. They don't understand that power imbalance at all, and so they make all kinds of promises, or they're not clear and direct about how they're feeling, and so you know, they sort of unintentionally string people along for a long time. And so I do really appreciate Miguel's point about, like, you can learn how to do good philanthropy, but it is a specific set of skills that you have to learn, and not everybody does it well. That said, I also agree with Nienke, and you know, we do have to really open up our processes. We're very risk averse, and you know, as I said yesterday on our panel, you know, the sort of tragedy I see in philanthropy is we have incredible ability to provide that, to be that risk taker and to provide that runway and to do all kinds of things, and we don't do that nearly enough. So I would love to see more of that. I don't know exactly what those structures look like, what they look like best, but I would love to see some loosening of control of the way that we do our work.
Stephanie, do you want to have the final word on?
Well, I couldn't agree more with all the others. And as Molly also said, it's the same in Europe, and especially in Germany. The foundation sector still is a very conservative sector. Unfortunately, I have to be honest and say that.
I mean, one of the challenges in Europe is that there are 47 countries and thousands, literally thousands of families, tens of thousands of family foundations who all have their own kind of set of values and strategies, and getting them to coordinate is incredibly hard. These four people on stage are actually, I think, pioneering a lot of those conversations. The Journalism Funders Forum, they've all been part of, and we definitely want to make sure that that conversation carries on forward, that we're putting resources together and helping everyone learn and develop. We are out of time, I'm afraid, but I will ask you to give a wonderfully huge round of applause to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Check out journalismfundersforum.org.com, one of those, Google it, and you will find it. And enjoy the rest of your festival. Thank you.